For the sake of ideology, Miliband, David Miliband, not Ted, is quite right in The Guardian, in The Observer today, to say that Britain should be uniting with its allies rather than dividing from them. And he says that the UK needs to enter new structures and commitments with the EU on foreign policy if it's going to become one of the key players in the world, one of the key players in the diplomatic climate, rather than one of the middle powers, one of the puffs of rhetoric that is irrelevant. And in a very short space of time, Britain has seen its significance destroyed, sidelined, and ignored. Why? Because it wants to carve out its own policies. It thinks that its own ideas are important. Its own ideas are now only going to be important when they're yoked with somebody else's, either with America, in which case submerged, or with Europe, in which case quite buoyant. And that's the role that Britain played while it was in Europe. And David Miliband is quite clear that that's the role that Britain has to play again. And under Labour, I imagine David Miliband will have some role to ensure that happens. I think there's a lot of plans by Labour which are seriously misguided, not least the idea of cutting back on foreign students in universities. Cutting back on foreign students in universities is going to further trim the possible budget that universities have at their disposal. We can't keep raising fees for British students and then cut foreign students who are the ones who pay those fees. So we've got to find a new way forward. And one of the solutions to that in the past was to take in European students on a sort of quasi-national basis rather than to see them as pure foreign students who would be fleeced. We've got to find a middle path, both in the things that we output, the things that we do well, and university is one of them, or at least used to be one of them. Education used to be one of the things we did well, and the things we can do. And at the moment we are submerged in one form of ideology, and if we're not careful, we're going to find ourselves submerged in another form of ideology. So, for example, with the reform of the House of Lords, great, it's well in need of reform. It's been in need of reform for a long time. But to reform the one bit of the House of Lords which is actually working relatively well on an ideological basis is madness. To commit to abolishing the hereditary peers when the hereditary peers are the ones who, having their own election, are contributing heavily to the power and the dynamism of debate in the House of Lords, and to ignore the fact that the real problem lies in the cronyism of those peers who are appointed by Sunak and Truss and Johnson, is to live in some sort of mad world. It's the cronies like Lebedev who need to be out of the door, not the hereditary lords who, despite their inheritance, are doing a relatively good job. And the Brown proposal for reform of the House of Lords is that the only proposal that has been put forward, because the Brown proposal is just one solution to an identified problem. The David Miliband solution is just one solution to an identified problem. And this shortcut approach to politics is not the best approach. We identify a problem and we look at multiple descriptions of that problem, and then we identify a number of possible solutions. We've got into a habit of identifying the problem and the solution and mixing the two together so the solution becomes the only solution available to the problem. That is the Rwanda situation, by the way. To reject Rwanda is not to reject the fact that there's a problem with small boats coming across the channel. Identifying where that problem comes from is another issue, and quite an interesting issue. But that's not the issue which we will see in the pages of the printed media, in the pages of the red tops. It's all about Rwanda. Rejecting Rwanda is to reject the migrant crisis. Equally, the fact that people are being put in danger, the fact that people, victims of oppression in their own country, are then further endangered by smugglers taking them across the channel or sending them across the channel. That is a reasonable observation. To then penalise them for having fled their own country and travelled across the channel and taken the word of what we call smugglers, what they call advice. It's almost impossible to identify in a war-torn country or a poor country who is giving authentic advice and who is a smuggler or a trafficker. It was almost impossible 20 years ago. I think it's probably even harder now. Smugglers and traffickers don't come with a badge on their lapel to tell you, I'm a smuggler, I'm a trafficker. They come with the patina of authority and trust. They command trust. And they demand money. And they offer, in many cases, the only solution. What we need to do is to get our solution out to the ground. We need to get our solution out to Afghanistan, out to Libya, out to Turkey, Albania, wherever people are travelling. We need to be there, and we need to be there in a consular form so that people can access us without having to go across the Mediterranean, without having to go across the Channel. We can lead the way in changing this issue about migration. If we put consular officials in the right places, other European countries would follow suit. The trafficking model would die overnight. Nobody would be travelling across the Mediterranean. No one would be travelling across the Channel. But I'm not sure the present government is interested in stopping that form of exploitation. I think that form of exploitation is an interesting distraction from the incompetence that otherwise is enveloping the Conservative Party. Back to Miliband, he says, in a world where the EU is shipping weapons to Ukraine, hosting 6 million Ukrainian refugees, is a major development actor, sits in the G20 and is a regulatory superpower in trade, climate and digital affairs, we need our mindset to change. A UK policy on Russia separate from the EU will be weaker and less effective. The same is true in respect of China. So the decision of the UK in 2019 to refuse a political and foreign policy relationship with the EU needs to be reversed. Structures and commitments need to be put in place to drive cooperation and coordination in the many areas of shared foreign policy, defence, security, and development policy interest. He is absolutely right. We need to be at the heart of European debate, even if we are not part of the European machinery directly, even if we're not part of Europe. We need to be within that European debate, and we need to be speaking as one.